Andy Condliffe beyefendiyi davet ediyorum huzurlarınıza. Kendisi EMEA Solution Architect'ten. Sir, hi.
Can you carry this for me?
No. So I'm going to talk about crowdsourced security and why it's the new weapon for your organization. So initially, let's sort of take a look at the landscape and what's happening. So we see traditional pen testing is vital. Most of our customers use it, but it's also failing. It's not really changed for 20 years. So the technology is unmeasured. What do we mean by that? It's when you're testing assets, there's no kind of real visibility of whether you've tested the entire infrastructure. If you're testing a website, have you looked at every URL and page in the website? So you don't have a clear picture of what's the scope of what's being carried out. The second is research data. So the general vulnerability scanners will have data in there for CVEs and known exploits and so on, but it's not really learning, and the pen testers don't have tools in the same way that are learning and taking information from other tests to make them more efficient, to make the pen testers more efficient by improving the technology that supports them. Also, they tend to use, if you engage with an organization, they're going to use the same tool set. So if you bring in a pen testing firm, they've probably got the same tool set, they probably work to the same framework, the same methodology, so that they're all working in the same way. So that's not really representative of what you'd see when you're being attacked from the black hat guys, the bad guys out there. The next area is the people themselves. So you get, there are some very good pen testers, but quite often on engagement, you'll get one senior, very good pen tester, and then possibly one or two junior testers. And it tends to be insufficient as well. You can't, the testers are very good, a lot of the testers are good, but you can't be an expert in everything. And organizations have so many different applications, different types of applications. You can't be an expert in everything. So scaling the testers up, it's too inefficient, cost is too high. The other thing, I can say this for the UK, I don't know if it's the same for Turkey, but you end up with this concept of report blow. So there seems to be this competition amongst pen testing firms to, their measure of success is who's generated the biggest report. So they'll fill it with, I've found the most serious possible vulnerability. Did you exploit it? Well, no, but we think it could be a really serious vulnerability. And I think as an industry, we don't push back and say, okay, well, go away, exploit it, show me how serious that is. And if you do that, what generally happens is that either the report comes back and it's either lowered in severity or it's disappeared completely. So that idea of report blow, and motivation as well. So if you're brought in for a 7-day test, you're going to go for the low. You want to find things for your report. So quite often that means they're going to go for low-hanging fruit. They're going to go for the easy-to-find vulnerabilities. They're not going to spend 20 hours looking for a difficult-to-find exploit and possibly fail, and then end up with nothing for the report. And then finally the process. So again, traditionally most pen testing has been focused around compliance. So again, it tends to be following checklists. It tends to be based around. So if you've got PCI, they'll be looking at the things that they see as important for you to tick your PCI box to make sure when your audit comes around, I've had my test and it's focused on these areas. So it's very focused on compliance rather than just going out and find vulnerabilities. And as I said as well, this aim for the low-hanging fruit. And there's again, one of the things that our customers like is the patch verification. So you get your report, you find your vulnerabilities, and you go away, you fix those vulnerabilities, or you think you fix those vulnerabilities. And what we find when we're testing is that quite often those vulnerabilities aren't resolved. So we recently did a test for one of the UK high street banks. And one of the most serious vulnerabilities we found, they already knew about it, but they told us they'd already fixed it. Well, did you test it afterwards? No. So security has always got to be cyclic. You've got to test it, measure, change. So you've got to go around. So if you're not testing those, the fixes that you've delivered, then it's useless. So you'll end up, if you're going down the traditional sort of quarterly testing, you've got a vulnerability that was there until it was discovered, and then if it's not patched properly, it's still there 3-6 months later. And finally, the sort of quality control. So there's no sort of quality control around a layer around it. They'll do an exploit. It worked for them. Here's the information we give you. If it works for you, great. If not, well, it worked for us. But cybercrime is still flourishing, and this is a kind of interesting statistical figure here. So back in 2014, Forbes did a study on the number of applications in a typical enterprise. It was 508. You look at now with the adoption of cloud, and everybody's becoming a lot of companies now are app developers and write their own software. Going back a few years, everybody, most people bought their software in. You had the big names, the Oracles, and I mean, they're still there, but people went out and they bought off-the-shelf software. Most companies now develop their own software. So Netscope found 1181 as an average of cloud services in a typical enterprise. And that doesn't mean that the internal applications have gone as well. So the whole attack surface has expanded massively. So again, trying to keep on top of that is extremely difficult. We also have the growing talent crisis or shortage. So at the moment, there's around 1 million cybersecurity positions unfilled, and Gartner say that's going to go to probably 3 million by 2021. So I don't know how, if you've tried to hire pen testers, certainly to get good pen testers, it's very hard. There's not not enough there, and this is only going to get worse. And if you look at the rate of attack and the number of incidents is growing sort of exponentially, but the number of qualified staff isn't. The next issue we see is really as well is around deployment, software deployment. So software deployment is moving more to, everyone's going now towards agile deployment, pushing updates out sort of daily, weekly, or even continuously. So the traditional sort of 2-week test doesn't really work in that example. So if I'm deploying every 2 weeks, or deploying every day or every week, I do a sort of traditional 2-week pen test, by the time the test is finished, never mind by the time you get the report, you've probably been through 2 or 3, maybe even 10 iterations of that software. So what was actually tested, and is it still valid? So what we've come up with at Synack is this platform for harnessing the power of the crowd to deliver that in a secure and controlled way to the customer. So it starts on the left with Hydra, which is our automated discovery tool. That we'll run that through the whole time of a test, but we'll start that sort of 48 hours before we bring testers in. So that's going to do the discovery. It's going to use some of our tools, some commercial tools. It's going to map out the environment. So the idea is when we invite the human element, they're not all going to have to sit down and start all their tools and run through that process. The breadcrumbs are there. A lot of the groundwork has been done, and they can just start focusing purely on doing their, finding the exploits and generating the vulnerabilities. Now that all goes through LaunchPoint, which is our central platform. So that gives us, two main benefits really: full visibility of all the traffic, so we know exactly what the testers are doing. We do full packet capture, so we can see exactly what they're doing. We've got an audit trail. So from a sort of compliance point of view and everything else, we know where we are. We've got all that information. But also that gives us gives us intelligence about what they're doing. So again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, if we're looking at a website, for example, we can look at all the areas of the website. We can make sure they're focusing, if we're doing an infrastructure test, we can make sure that they've looked at every IP in that infrastructure. So we have all that data there to use. And I'll go through these in a bit more detail. Alongside that, we have our mission operations people. So as we find vulnerabilities, we're doing that QA, and they're there to make sure that what the customer ends up with is valid, it's written properly, it's reproducible, and so on. And then the client portal. So as an organization, you can log in, you can see in sort of near real time what's happening. You'll see the vulnerabilities as we find them. You'll see them. You can generate reports, and you have access to all that information. So the normal question I get going out to customers, and I say, we're using 800 to 1,000 ethical hackers, and organizations say, whoa, what, you mean hackers? You're going to have hackers on my network? So the first thing we want to say is these are very seriously vetted, and that I know I've had the privilege to meet some of the Red Team members who are in the conference today. So there's some of the guys that do work for us are here, and they can tell you this whole process takes several months. So we start with initial video interviews, trying to understand the backgrounds, what the skill set is. They then go through to a skill assessment. So it's a very it's a very difficult skill assessment. We want to make sure 80% of what we test is production systems. So we want to make sure that when they're testing, then they're not going at it with a sledgehammer. They're not going to crash the systems. They also have to pass tests in all the areas they want to work in. So if they want to test mobile applications, they have to have taken the mobile skills assessment. If they want to do web, they have to take that assessment. So some will focus just on one area, others will take multiple assessments and be skilled in multiple areas. If they get through that stage, we then go through and we do additional interviews, ethical interviews, because we want to make sure they're the right kind of people. We're introducing them into the company. We're taking liability for what they do. We take legal liability for what these guys do when they're testing your environment. So we want to make sure that these really are the white hats. They are the good guys. They're not going to find a vulnerability and then go and sell it somewhere else because they can get more money for it. They're doing it because they enjoy it. They want the challenge, and they want to help the industry. So if they get through all that, then they get to join the platform, and then they get invited into the tests. LaunchPoint, as I said, is our kind of central platform where everything goes into. So that gives us this security, the control over the testing, the auditability in terms of capturing all the traffic. We see exactly what's being tested, everything they're doing, and the real-time analytics we can then push into the portal for the customer to see. So the first thing, as I mentioned before, Hydra, we do that. We start Hydra on any test. That's going to do the initial reconnaissance. It's going to map out the attack surface. And it's going to detect changes, because sometimes we're doing continuous testing. So one of the options we have for customers is continuous testing. So we'll test 24/7 by 365. So when you're in that kind of environment, if someone does a software deployment, an update, we want to know that that's happened. And sometimes the customers will tell us, and we can pass the information on and tell the guys and girls to focus on that area. But even if they don't, Hydra will pick it up. We map everything out. We monitor for change, so we can see something's changed. We can point them in that direction. They'll see it in their portal, so they'll know that there's something to look for. And it will discover the kind of the low-level vulnerabilities. It will say there's suspected vulnerabilities here. So it's doing what to some extent, what your traditional vulnerability scanners do. It's very noisy. There's going to be lots of false positives, which is why we don't expose that to the customers. But it's creating that information that we feed through to the SRT. So once they've got the information, they've gone out, they've managed to exploit a vulnerability in your environment. They upload that into our portal. Now, I've got an example in a second, you can see, but we insist on certain things on the vulnerability. We have to have a description. There has to be an impact. What does this mean to the customer? And then the steps to reproduce. So how exactly do you re-exploit this vulnerability? So as if that means that the guy had to write code, then they'll have to share that as part of the submission. And then finally, they have to give a remediation advice. So when we present it to the customer, we validate that. Our mission ops will go through. They'll make sure that they can recreate it. They make sure it's written up correctly, that the remediation advice is in there, and everything's there. As soon as we accept it, it appears in the customer portal, which means that we get sort of around about a 98% signal-to-noise ratio. 98% of what we push into the portal is real exploitable vulnerabilities that are useful to the customers. And I say it gets rid of all that noise, and then they'll also assist you with triage, with going through the whole process of remediation as well. So as well as the testers will help with that, and you can communicate with the testers through the portal. But our mission ops are 24/7, so they can help you as well. They can assist you in recreating it, in fixing it, and so on. And as I kind of alluded to a second ago, if deployment is continuous, then your testing needs to be continuous. You can't. There's no point in deploying new versions every day and then testing every 3 months. It just doesn't make sense. So with the continuous testing that we can offer, you'll have what we typically do is assign around 50 to 60 testers to that project for about 6 weeks. Because at the end of 6 weeks, they've probably found what they're going to find. They're probably getting bored and want to move on to the next project. So we cycle all 60 out, we cycle a new 60 in. Now, the red team are in 55 countries globally. So there's always going to be some of those online. So when we talk about continuous, it really is 24/7 by 365. Now, you won't have all 60 on at the same time, but as we've got testers in sort of from Australia through to Hawaii and everywhere in between, there's always going to be some that are working in that time zone. So you'll always have half a dozen testers. So anytime you push an update out, there'll be testers there immediately on it, looking at it, trying to find weaknesses in it. So as well as getting the different 50 different sets of eyes, all with their own different toolkits, all with their own methodologies, looking at that, looking at your software. Every 60 days, we cycle them out and get a new fresh set of eyes. So I mean, a lot of traditional banks and organizations that were serious about security would change their pen testing firms every 6 months, every 2 years, whatever, so that you're bringing fresh eyes, fresh talent in. But we can do that every 6 weeks, and with nearly 1,000 testers, we can cycle through those for a couple of years before we go back to the original ones. And by then, probably the environment's changed so much that they'll come back on. It's a fresh challenge, lots of new. It's probably completely rewritten, lots of new vulnerabilities to find. So it works very well. So I've talked a lot about this kind of ad hoc testing. We're going to throw these guys in. They've all got their own tools. But a lot of organizations require compliance. So you have a PCI compliance, or you have NIST or whatever. So we introduced this concept of missions. And the way this works is the team will grab a mission each, or 2 or 3 missions each, and they'll go through and check them. And these are OWASP best practice, for example. So this is a premium web check. So there's 84 checks. It would look at things like password complexity. Are you using uppercase, lowercase characters and numbers? Are you using 8 characters and so on? So at the end of the process, which would probably take about 24 hours because you've got all these people doing this in parallel, you'll have a report you can present to an auditor to show that you're following best practice. Maybe you'll fail on some, as most people will fail on some. Some of these you may not care about. You might decide clickjacking is too low a priority for you to worry about, or whatever. But there'll be evidence, there'll be screenshots. So again, we spent a lot of time with Coalfire in the US to make sure that what we produced was acceptable to a QSA in a PCI audit. So these are very detailed and useful reports. I know I'm very quickly running out of time, so I'll quickly go through these. So this is an example of a report. So there's the description, how it was created, and then this discussion, so again, in the vulnerability report, there's a tab at the bottom. You can have a discussion with the tester. So if you want more information, you want advice, you can have that conversation with the tester. The other thing I talked about was full control. So because all the testers come through us, and through LaunchPoint, at any time you can pause the test. So all the traffic's going to come from our IP range, so you can differentiate between what we're doing and a genuine attack. And if you think we're impacting the business in some way, and there's an issue, or as probably more likely that happens quite often, is they get a serious attack during one of the tests. Just pause the test, and then you can see what's the real test. What's the it just takes us out of the equation. It just solves that problem. The long-term goal is to become more attacker resistant, and this is data from one of our customers on a continuous test. And we've come up with this patented algorithm which, based on the difficulty to exploit, the skill of the tester, the time it takes to test, and when you're doing continuous testing, the time it takes you to remediate as well, we come up with this score. So you'll be able to plot over time how you're improving, and also you'll see if we're testing multiple applications, which ones are very strong and which ones are very weak. You might have different teams on writing different applications. So you can see, one team may need some assistance. Why are they, in the example here, why is one on 22 and one on 95? That's a huge difference in performance. So it's only slightly over. Thank you very much.